And greetings, everyone. Well, it's quite obvious that there is a lot of agitation out there, a lot of outrage for all the right reasons in the wake of the release of the Epstein Files. But here I'm not to add to these agitations, and perhaps it would be more wise to sit with it more and offer reflections when something will settle down, however long that would take. I'm not sure. So perhaps this can be simply offered as this most immediate response, and not necessarily a response that aims to address what exactly happened, what we all now collectively witnessing in the aftermath of what was brewing there for a very long time, what many have been simply dismissing as conspiratorial now simply became a reality, where wildest conspiracy theory pales in comparison, we could even say. So what I felt compelled is to share something which, out of necessity of this, what I have initiated this kind of reflections in the first place, brings the reminder of where the real shift taking place, and so as not to get swept by what is being communicated out there at the obvious plane, we could say at that surface plane, at the plane of Vaikari, speaking that tantric language. So, and as I said, this would be the most immediate offering, response, and I'm sure we would need to come back to this, perhaps with a deeper dive. And before I venture into this, I want to also say something that not everyone would agree with these reflections. Some may even get triggered by them, which is absolutely fine and part of why these reflections are as they are. I speak what's on my heart, and I speak from the place where the information received has had the chance to get processed at the level of my understanding, at the level and at the capacity of what I've managed to forge out of myself to bring to the level where it is available to whatever degree of synthesis. So, as this outrage that raging on is totally and utterly justifiable, we should also bear in mind, those of us who have given ourselves to the spiritual fostering, to the domain of the soul's homecoming, that reality is made of different levels. And at each of its levels, there are different laws operating. All of them, of course, are always subordinate to one and only supreme reality. And yet, there are respective laws within the creation where that reality, effectively speaking, that unnamable reality is structured throughout. So we can loosely break it down to make, for the sake of easy way of addressing this in this conversation, into three levels. And I have earlier written something here in front of me, not as any kind of attempt to write an article or essay, simply as notes for myself to perhaps help me to keep with all this intact for the sake of coherence, so as not to get lost in the meanderings of what rises in the moment, as still very much in that agitated field that is perceived even with regard to how the weather is behaving in the last few weeks. So what are we learning here? What is the most obvious that we are experiencing right now? It's the release of the information that shaking the world in variety of ways, where people frantically looking for names, perhaps including names of those who might have been idolized, names not only those who are most immediately configured in the social political discourse out there as the so-called biggest movers and shakers of it all. Speaking of that elite of the society, the governmental structure represented by individuals of various countries, mostly Anglo-Saxon domain here, America and the United Kingdom, but not only. But these files, of course, include people from entertainment industries, performers. It includes scientists, researchers, obviously speakers, public figures of all kinds. And this list, of course, no doubt includes these people who are the movers and shakers of the New Age, as became apparent in the last 48 hours, that those who profess to guide us in the domain of spirit have enormous lapses when it comes to their personal affairs and the way they conduct their life. But I'm not here to lay a blame or join in the voice of that outrage, as I said, justified on all points, but rather to draw our attention here to the deeper dimension of reality, where that battle for our attention has always raged on. So therefore, I've loosely titled this as 3 levels of the battle. The battle that goes on at the gross level of creation, that vicary level, and that primarily is where our attention is funneled. We could say this with the example of a bazaar, a marketplace. Just as a footnote, like just sharing something, I grew up in Uzbekistan, as many of you know, and when you stroll in the big open markets or closed markets of Tashkent, there are quite a few, but let's say go to the biggest one for that full experience. It is very well known how people present their products. They lay them all out in the most spectacular manner they possibly could. And you go through this rows of, let's say, rows of apples, the grapes, the pomegranates, or the spices, or whatever that is now being brought to the market to be sold. People are shouting at any passerby to attract their attention. They break that bread, they break that pomegranate, they cut that apple, they stretch it out for you to try, only to that direct your attention, even if momentarily, so as to grab it and perhaps making you into the buyer. So obvious, so normal. That very same principle is applied to our attention in the vast marketplace that currently is our socio-economical political structure, where the attention is immediately, of course, becomes the currency. And that attention is where we willingly or not, consciously or not, giving of ourselves to whatever that is then presented as an information. So this first level, that gross level of reality, is where obviously the most immediate collision takes place for our attention. I call it battle consciously. So this first battle taking place at the level of the gross sphere of reality, where we are constantly pulled in every direction so as to give, by virtue of funneling our attention somewhere, and multiply and increase the possibility of this or that product being worthy of consumption, to put it plainly. In other words, to turn that attention into the currency eventually, whether we are aware of it or not, whether the product is something that we wear, something that we nourish our body with, or intellectual product, that's something we nourish our senses, and so forth, and so on. Let's put a pause here and move to the level of which we could speak of as mental or subtle plane. This subtle plane of reality is something which, effectively speaking, in the relation to what I have the audacity to redress here, is manufacturing the interpretation. I want to read you something I scribbled here earlier. So, the most powerful form of control is not actually the censorship, but the interpretation. If someone tells you what to think about it, they already there and then influencing you. If someone tells you how to think about it, they are there and then shaping you. So therefore, at the subtle level, the impact is much more powerful. I can try this product on the market, that freshly baked loaf in the tandoori, and say, no, thank you, I'll carry on walking and try other products. I can bite that fruit and say, well, it's sweet, but there may be something sweeter, and keep walking in continuing testing things in the marketplace of what is on offer. Here, however, the example and the reality of experience is much, much more refined and much subtler. And therefore, we speak of it as manufacturing interpretation or manufacturing consent. It's a control of narrative versus control of interpretation, information versus framing, and manufacturing consent eventually, which is in itself could be called forging of the psychological warfare. This is the psychological warfare that's taking place at the subtle level. The subtle level is, of course, composed of all the mental impressions, mental and emotional impressions, because it's not just thought and mind's activity. This, of course, includes the impressions in terms of our emotive responses, feelings we have about this or that. All that, of course, invokes something. Whatever emotion that can be pulled out as a response to certain stimuli, certain information, there and then contributes to that what we speak of here as formation of psychological warfare. Please bear with me. Again, I deliberately dubbed it as a warfare because it's already from get-going spoken from the place of how there is a battle on different planes of creation. And this battle is for your and mine attention, or rather through your and mine attention, and then through the interpretation of what your attention falls into. Whatever you become temporarily fascinated by, attracted by, interested by, there and then that process of interpretation begins. And so that process of interpretation is where the consensus reality is being made into the collective understanding, shared collective reality, that we then live by as willing participants, whether we know it or not. Even if we complain about this aspect of reality, we are settled on that aspect of reality. So, of course, these are different groups, different, it's not all that homogeneous. This is obviously how our society is made. And within that, there are different divergent fields. And within these different divergent fields, there is this constant attempt at hijacking that attention so as to create the, literally, as to shape you and me in the way that certain, let's say, collectively shared consensus can become unquestionable way of the way we live. So this manufacturing of the consent of the through the interpretation is what makes all that what's out there in terms of from entertainment to news to relating anything that, let's say, latest discovery to the grandest ideas that are communicated openly, let's say, in the gatherings like of the kind of one just took place in Davos, where now the movers and shakers of the intellectual, let's say, realm are presenting us with the way we are purportedly, according to their understanding, according to their vision, are faced with. And we are supposed to take this at the face value because this is, again, presented as a matter of fact. And by presenting this, it goes through that very attention and towards the interpretation and resulting in the formation, shaping. So we are from here moving to what we will speak of as the finest level. The finest level here would not be the causal level, although that would be the most, let's say, coherent if it was a purely spiritual discourse. We're not speaking here about, let's say, this, gross body, subtle body, causal body. We are moving straight here to the domain of consciousness. The domain of consciousness is where the biggest battle for yours and my consciousness is taking place. The biggest and the most important, I would even say potentially the most ancient, and certainly in relation to our modern time, where the most desperate attempts were made to hack consciousness by hook or by crook, by virtue of utilizing mostly perennial teachings so as to create the possibility for forming collective consciousness to the way it would be considered appropriate by the elites and by the ruling, let's say, governmental structures of this or that societal order. So, what do we mean by hacking consciousness? And with that, we need to simply ask any contemporary neuroscientist that to give us a confirmation that human perception is malleable, programmable. And because of the way our perception can be programmed, that program literally is written deep within at the cellular level of our behavior, of our responses, of our actions, of our interactions, and effectively speaking, of our ways of being. So this is accompanied, of course, by centuries now old interests in all things occult and esoteric, But we're not going to go that far. We're only going to go at the break of the 19th to the 20th century, maybe beginning of the 20th century even, just something which takes us only 100 years back, where these attempts were the most prominently made as far back as the first years of the formation of the Soviet Union as an independent state. Just the first years after the revolution, whilst the Soviet Union was still fighting many wars, internal and external, including the Civil War, there were already expeditions mounted deep into Siberia, where they believed to have had access to this knowledge preserved by the Siberian shamans. These very expeditions were also mounted by the Soviets to Bhutan, Nepal, and Tibet, only to be followed by the Nazis a decade later, with all the interest that Nazis always had towards all things occult. We have spoken in some of our podcasts and some of our sharing and live programs, online events about this before, and it is very well documented, so you can look it up. And then we can also extend this further, how in post-war period, post-Second World War, how the main two camps as these opposing powers during the Cold War, the Soviets and the Americans, were conducting various different researches in the domain of consciousness, primarily in view of utilizing it for psycho warfare. So, of course, with that, it could be and should be added not just for the psycho warfare, but perhaps first and foremost for that what would give the possibility for manipulating the minds of very large groups of people without having to indoctrinate them through slogans, ideology, and so forth, which is the surface level, the gross level. So this is where the real battle has always been settled, at the level of consciousness, at the level of what this human being represents in the first place. Of course, only, I would say, couple decades, maybe even decade before, this would all be sounded way too conspiratorial, way too kind of like David Icke kind of thing. That all this is, the Anunnakis, with all these different races of the lizards and reptilians who are inhibiting the human race in order to enslave them, and all the rest of that. We also know, of course, all this in parallel, reflected through all the epics and myths throughout the world, how there were always these outwardly powers trying to usurp what humans always represented here, which takes us back to that biblical notion of what human really is, taking us all the way to the role and the status of the Adam and Eve, to the anthropomorphic notion of the Purusha, and the anthropomorphic notion of the what came with the code of Manu in the Hindu civilization. The ideas that a human being here is the guardian and the gardener of this Garden of Eden, which Earth supposed to represent in the first place by design, and therefore humans, because of their status being made in the image of Imago Dei, they are not just fit, they are designed literally to be this very, very force, the very, very loving, compassionate force that maintains the balance in creation, which is inevitably, of course, made of the opposing forces. But it is in human being where these opposing forces meant to find their perfect resolution, perfect balance. It is in a level of human consciousness where this balance is maintained. So this balance, of course, we know that without any shadow of a doubt has been tilted tilted for a prolonged period of time towards tremendous imbalance. This is partially also, not to make this as a plug-in, simply what serves as a red thread that runs through the book just published, Kundalini, major volume, right? As that goddess behind all self-realizations. It runs throughout the book as that very important theme, as the major arc of what the human affair here truly represents. So what I wanted to relate in these very reflections in relation to that tremendous, let's say, agitation that all of us experience now on the collective level with the release of the files, how people like Epstein have always had, we could say healthy or unhealthy, whichever way you want to put it, interest in all things that are to do with hacking of consciousness, in transhumanism, all this interest in how things can be made in such a way that these grand ideas can be carried out into the open for the humanity to simply accept this as a shared reality that meant not to be questioned. Of course, this somehow obviously glitch in the matrix itself, where that boys club's insatiable desire for carnal pleasures, because when there's a tremendous catastrophic lapse of ethos taking place, where interest in consciousness is not coming from the place of the evolution of soul and knowing that this is the domain which meant to belong only for that what soul, human soul here represents as the guardian of creation. And the guardian of creation on all its levels, where the human neurophysiology, where the human consciousness here sustains creation at all its levels, maintains the balance with that always impetus and always in intention that sankalpa to rise above the limitations, that rise above this, let's say, what represents as that, what links us to the biological life, that what makes us humans as opposed to animals. Obviously, without that understanding, the enormous amount of wealth opens up the possibility for indulging into the carnal pleasures at the maximum degree. In other words, going through as a knife through the butter, through all the taboos, because there is no longer any boundaries. So no longer any warnings issued by the likes of Nabokov's Lolita, which is still misinterpreted to this day as a great work of art and also as the great warning by that Russian writer who expressed himself extraordinarily precise and beautiful in English prose, where that has been adopted by the elite as a kind of a license to indulge in the story of Lolita. Here I'd like to put a pause and make a extensive footnote into all this interest in all things associated with hacking consciousness. It's not a secret that some of these most coveted, most hidden teachings, including those who have been safeguarded for thousands of years, perhaps, in these pockets, libraries, in the Himalayas, in Central Asia, where, for example, the legendary Gurdjieff went hiking in hopes to encounter those living masters he believed still must be there, in the possession of these extraordinary teachings, undiluted as they have inevitably became in the Occident. It is where the Nazi anthropologists, ethnographers, and conscious researchers went to Nepal and Bhutan and Tibet to go through the scriptures, equipped with the help of the Sanskritists, best Sanskritists of their time. Obviously, that a lot of this work have been ended up in the hands of those who were tapering with it for all the wrong reasons. Let me just mention something here. Some of the tantric scriptures speak of the whether this is taken literally or not, of the way how the aging male body organism can be revitalized through sexual intercourse with the younger female. It's written even in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, the most commonly known, variously translated yogic text, and it's not even that old. It dates to the 15th century of Common Era. That these exercises, specific procedures meant to be performed by male adepts to extract that female essence in the juices from the yoni through the application of certain, let's say, mastered ways of applying the straw through the ureter of the penis into the, let's say, straight, being able to drink it literally, as with the straw. This is available out there, but there are more hidden scriptures, of course. And these interpretations maybe have taken the wrong turn. Very often we read of the description of the goddess as being forever 16-year-old. And this we can also find in references in the tantric literature, in tantric scriptures, how this aging male organism can be revitalized. Is there a possibility that some of these people, this boys club, got hold of this information and somehow indulging in it from all levels, not just for the carnal pleasure we're told, but also in view of a kind of retreat to revitalize their aging bodies? You see, the line of transhumanism, these attempts at turning this body into the immortal vessel, is the top priority of the wealthiest people out there, who have completely and utterly broke away from the perennial understanding of what the human life here represents. And above all else, from the most important understanding of what this whole embodiment is really about, what this embodiment truly represents, that transition, that phase that we are here in life eternal of our soul, in each particular incarnation. So that what we're speaking about here is enormous lapse in the ethos, the grand ethos of what true spirituality meant to represent. I don't want to now be misunderstood, please don't. But all the teachings in the New Age, including the Neo-Advaita and Neo-Tantra, non-dualism, have sanitized the true ethos of spiritual enterprise to this, let's say, attempts at making it sterile, conscious only, awareness only model, where nothing of this really matters. It's not really happening. Epiphenomenon I can put my hand through, literally, oxymoronically, and as oxymoronically as this sounds, or as paradoxically inconsistent. Literally, that's how some people speak about this. Not to mention the names, but the discourse of the Yuval Harari at the Davos just now, giving us the perspective that we are entering the age of Homo sapiens versus artificial intelligence is a grotesquely, it's a grotesque attempt at giving a new narrative to the very old story, story that outlived itself, story for that utopian attempts at creating some kind of utopian societies here, utopian ideas of turning this biological, let's say, vehicle into eternal, somehow, body. For what? This is the bankruptcy, spiritual bankruptcy and ethical bankruptcy, and the fact that it only reverberates and manifests itself at the gross level of reality in the most devastatingly disgusting way of how this expresses itself on what was taking place on that island and what these files are now revealing us. So these files really, it's not about the Epstein's files. We are speaking here, or rather attempting to speak here, to what is really taking place. And I welcome all of you to share your deeply personal understanding or take on this. On this, what you're experiencing. Yes, the outrage is there. Yes, we share that outrage. I am the father of still a 6-year-old girl. I fathered 4 daughters. For me, it's painful as a human being to hear and witness all this. But at the very same time, I don't want to go on that level of leaking emotionally, completely allowing myself to break down to how this affects me at the level of, let's say, of the immediate impact of the nauseating content of what this really, what really took place there. I feel this is an invitation to reevaluate entirely what this presents us with as human beings right now. So this Epstein Files is a mirror. And Epstein himself, it's very easy to villainize him and all others who are there, right? And to kind of like withdraw ourselves from any necessity for self-evaluation is not very healthy. Maybe it is also someone's deeply hidden agenda to do exactly that. So we can just throw a few people under the bus, even if it's hundreds of people, and these people are somehow giving us the possibility to brush off our, brush ourselves off of all that nasty dust and move on. That's not going to fly. What we are witnessing here is a day of reckoning, a true reckoning. And that reckoning is here simply mirrored through this horrific event, which took place in a prolonged period of time, causing so much pain and distress and agony to so many people, children, not even teenagers, children, young girls and boys, both genders suffered there. These peoples, these victims of this outburst of consciousness displaying itself in such a way that is despicable because we have somehow adopted this way where the values are trampled. And these trampled values, the ethos is distorted, is in the hands of those who are purportedly weaving the reality for us into the current century with the narratives that they speak of as if they are the custodians here to safeguard. No, I don't believe so. So this is what I wanted to share as like that most immediate, let's say, what rises here and swells in an attempt to communicate something very important, I believe, as a reminder where the real battle taking place. Battle here is for your and my consciousness. And it is that battle that we cannot afford to lose. So thank you. And do share, and welcome to give your responses in the comments. Bye for now.